At 8:15 a.m. on August 6, 1945, a bombardier named Thomas Farabee looked through his Norden bomb sight at a T-shaped bridge in the heart of Hiroshima. He'd trained for this exact release point for weeks. When Little Boy finally fell, it missed that bridge by nearly 800 feet, and it still became the deadliest single airstrike in human history. That gap between the plan and the reality is where this story actually lives, not in the mushroom cloud everyone's seen 100 times, but in the arguments between generals, the honeymoon memory that saved a city, and the one man who survived this exact bomb twice. This is the part of Hiroshima nobody put in your textbook. Part 1. The Bridge They Never Hit. The 509th Composite Group didn't train for months by accident. Records held at the U.S. Air Force Historical Research Agency show this was the most rehearsed bombing run of the entire war. A single aircraft, a single bomb, and almost no room for error. Their target wasn't a factory or a barracks, it was the Aioi Bridge, a distinctive T-shaped span crossing the Oda River in the heart of Hiroshima, chosen specifically because its unusual shape made it one of the most identifiable aiming points in the entire city. From 31,000 feet through a Norden bomb site, Bombardier Thomas Farabee had studied reconnaissance photos of that bridge until he could probably draw it from memory. At 8:15 a.m. on August 6, 1945, he released the weapon. Here's the detail most retellings skip entirely. It missed. The bomb detonated nearly 800 feet from the bridge, a wide miss by the standards of a mission this precisely engineered. It didn't matter. The weapon wasn't designed like conventional ordnance, where a near miss means a target survives. It was designed to level roughly 5 square miles, regardless of where exactly it landed within that radius. That single fact reframes the whole myth of surgical precision that's followed this mission for 80 years. This wasn't a scalpel. The margin for error was measured in city blocks, not feet. And everyone who approved the mission knew that going in. The National World War II Museum's archives on the mission make clear this wasn't the first attempt at a perfect strike either. Weather reconnaissance planes had scouted 3 potential targets that morning: Hiroshima, Kokura, and Nagasaki, and Hiroshima simply had the clearest skies. Clear skies, not strategic necessity alone, decided which city would be first. So before we get to Truman, to Oppenheimer, to the men who built this weapon 2 years earlier in a New Mexico desert, it's worth sitting with this. The mission that changed the shape of modern warfare didn't unfold with the clean precision the word atomic implies. It unfolded the way most history actually does. Under pressure, with margins, and with weather. Part 2. Racing the Clock, Trinity, and the Weight of One Decision. To understand why Hiroshima happened at all, you have to go back 3 weeks to a stretch of New Mexico desert most Americans had never heard of and still haven't seen. On July 16, 1945, a team led by physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer and Army General Leslie Groves detonated the world's first nuclear device at a site they'd codenamed Trinity. Declassified footage and reports held at the National Archives show the blast lit the pre-dawn sky bright enough to be seen from towns over 100 miles away. Some residents later reported they thought the sun had risen twice. Physicist Kenneth Bainbridge, the test director, turned to Oppenheimer moments after the blast and said they were now, in his words, all sons of bitches. It's one of the few lines from that morning historians treat as reliably documented, and it tells you everything about the mood on the ground. This wasn't triumph, it was dread mixed with relief that the thing had actually worked. Here's the part that gets flattened in most retellings. Harry Truman didn't build this weapon, and he didn't inherit the decision the way people assume. He'd been vice president for only 82 days when Franklin Roosevelt died in April 1945, and by his own later accounts, he hadn't even been briefed on the Manhattan Project's existence until after he was sworn in. He learned the full scope of the bomb's power while overseas at the Potsdam Conference in Germany, negotiating the post-war order with Stalin and Churchill, barely 3 months into the job. At the same time, American planners were staring down brutal arithmetic. The Battle of Okinawa had just ended in June 1945, costing over 12,000 American lives, and by some Army Center of Military History estimates, upward of 100,000 Japanese military and civilian deaths combined for a single island. Projections for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of the Japanese home islands, ran into hundreds of thousands of potential American casualties, with Japanese losses potentially far higher. That's the position Truman stood in by early August, a brand new president, a weapon he hadn't asked for, and a war that showed no signs of ending on its own.
Part 3. The City That Was Spared. Before a single bomb fell, a quieter argument was already deciding who would live and who wouldn't, and it had almost nothing to do with military targeting logic. Secretary of War Henry Stimson was the man responsible for approving the final target list. Records from his wartime diary, held today at Yale, but referenced extensively in National Archives materials and Smithsonian retrospectives, show he personally intervened to strike one city from consideration entirely: Kyoto. His reasoning wasn't strategic. Stimson had visited Kyoto decades earlier and, by several historical accounts, had honeymooned there with his wife. He considered it the cultural and religious heart of Japan, home to countless temples and shrines, and argued that destroying a city of that significance would create a bitterness toward the United States that could last for generations, regardless of how the war ended. General Groves pushed back hard. Kyoto was large, industrially significant, and had been deliberately spared conventional bombing, which made it a clean target for measuring atomic effects. Stimson took the matter directly to Truman. Kyoto came off the list. That decision had a direct consequence for another city. Hiroshima moved up in priority for exactly the same reason Kyoto had been protected by conventional bombing. It, too, had been largely untouched by earlier air raids, which meant military planners could accurately measure the bomb's destructive radius against a mostly intact city. It also housed a significant Japanese military headquarters, giving it a genuine strategic justification the planners could point to. This is worth sitting with for a moment. The idea that these targets were chosen by a cold, purely mathematical military process isn't quite right. A single man's personal memory of a honeymoon likely saved an entire city of temples and shrines from destruction, and by consequence shifted the weight of history onto another city instead. It's one of the clearest reminders in this entire story. Monumental, world-altering decisions were still being made, argued over, and revised by individual men in rooms right up until the morning the plane took off.
Part 4. August 6th. The mission itself. By the time the sun rose over Tinian Island on August 6, 1945, the men of the 509th Composite Group had been preparing for this exact morning for the better part of a year. The aircraft chosen to carry the weapon was a B-29 Superfortress commanded by Colonel Paul Tibbets, a 30-year-old officer who had personally selected and trained the unit for this single mission.
According to accounts preserved by the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force, Tibbets named the plane the night before takeoff, painting his mother's name, Enola Gay, on the nose himself. At 2:45 a.m., the aircraft lifted off Tinian's runway, carrying a weapon nicknamed Little Boy, a gun-type uranium bomb that, remarkably, had never actually been tested before this mission. Trinity had tested a plutonium design. This uranium design was considered reliable enough by its engineers that they'd skipped a live test entirely, meaning the crew flying it that morning were, in effect, the first real trial of the weapon itself. At 8:15 a.m. local time, Bombardier Thomas Farabee released the bomb from 31,000 feet. It fell for 43 seconds before detonating roughly 1,900 feet above the city, an airburst deliberately chosen over a ground detonation because it maximized the blast radius across a wider area. From the plane, tail gunner Robert Carone later described watching a column of smoke and debris rise and boil upward, forming a shape none of the crew had a word for yet. Co-pilot Robert Lewis reportedly wrote in his log something to the effect that he didn't know what to feel, other than that he now understood what he'd been part of. On the ground, there was no equivalent vantage point. No distance, no altitude. In the roughly 1-mile radius closest to the blast, the destruction was near total and near instantaneous. Farther out, survivors described a flash brighter than the sun, followed by a wave of heat and pressure that leveled wooden structures for miles. Estimates of the dead in Hiroshima by the end of 1945, accounting for those who died in the following months from burns, injuries, and radiation sickness, range between roughly 90,000 and 146,000 people, the overwhelming majority of them civilians.
Part 5. 3 Days, 2 Cities. The Reprieve of Kokura. 3 days later, a second mission launched, and its story is defined almost entirely by an accident of weather that most people have never heard. On August 9th, a B-29 named Boxcar, piloted by Major Charles Sweeney, took off from Tinian carrying a plutonium implosion weapon nicknamed Fat Man. Its target that morning was not Nagasaki. It was Kokura, a city chosen specifically because it housed one of the largest military arsenals in Japan. According to accounts preserved by the U.S. Air Force Historical Research Agency, Sweeney's crew made 3 separate bombing runs over Kokura, circling back each time. Each attempt was aborted for the same reason: thick haze and smoke drifting over the city from a conventional firebombing raid the U.S. Army Air Forces had carried out on the nearby city of Iwata the day before had obscured the visual sighting required for the drop. Bombardiers on this mission were under strict orders to visually confirm the target. No radar-only drops were authorized for this weapon. Running low on fuel after the third pass, and with Japanese anti-aircraft fire intensifying below, Sweeney made the call to divert to the mission's secondary target, Nagasaki. Nagasaki wasn't even fully visible when they arrived. Cloud cover had rolled in there, too. Bombardier Kermit Behan found a brief gap in the clouds over the city's industrial Urakami Valley and released the weapon at 11:02 a.m., detonating roughly 1,650 feet above ground. The human cost of that diversion is staggering to sit with. Kokura's arsenal workers went home that night, never knowing how close they'd come.
Nagasaki, a city that was a secondary, almost incidental target, absorbed the blast instead, including, tragically, an unknown number of Allied prisoners of war held in a camp near the impact zone, alongside Japanese shipyard and munitions workers. Historians researching this event, including work referenced by HistoryNet and the Naval History and Heritage Command, have come to call Kokura's survival one of the starkest examples of pure chance altering the course of a historical catastrophe. A firebombing raid on a different city the day before is the reason Nagasaki, not Kokura, carries this weight in American memory today.
Part 6. The Man Who Survived Twice. If there's one human story that captures the sheer improbability of these 3 days, it belongs to a Mitsubishi engineer named Tsutomu Yamaguchi. On the morning of August 6th, Yamaguchi was in Hiroshima on a business trip, preparing to head home after finishing a 3-month assignment for his employer. He was roughly 2 miles from the hypocenter when the bomb detonated. The blast ruptured his eardrums, burned the upper half of his body, and temporarily blinded him. By his own later accounts, documented in interviews preserved through Japanese oral history archives and referenced by outlets including BBC History, he spent that night in a bomb shelter alongside other survivors, badly injured but alive. The next day, bandaged and in pain, he did something almost unthinkable. He boarded a train home. His destination was Nagasaki. He arrived on August 8th, reported to his company's Nagasaki office the following morning to describe what he'd witnessed in Hiroshima, and was in the middle of explaining the destruction to a skeptical supervisor, reportedly being told a single bomb couldn't possibly have done what he was describing, when the second flash lit the sky outside the window. Nagasaki was hit at 11:02 a.m. on November 9th, and Yamaguchi survived that blast too, this time largely uninjured by the initial detonation, though he was exposed once again to the fallout. He is the only person the Japanese government has ever officially recognized as a survivor of both atomic bombings, a status confirmed by Nagasaki city officials in 2009, decades after the war. He went on to live a full life, working, raising a family, and largely staying out of public attention for most of his years. It was only in his final decade that he began speaking publicly and extensively about what he'd witnessed, becoming an outspoken advocate for global nuclear disarmament until his death in 2010 at the age of 93. His story isn't presented here as some kind of statistical curiosity. It's a reminder that behind every casualty figure in this history, the tens of thousands counted and the ones like Yamaguchi who weren't, there's an individual human timeline full of coincidence, decisions, and survival that no chart can capture. Part 7. The Soviet Shockwave. Here, where the American memory of this story and the full historical record start to pull apart, and it's the piece most textbooks leave out entirely. Many Americans grew up believing the 2 atomic bombs alone forced Japan's surrender. The documented picture, drawn from Japanese government records and cross-referenced by historians through sources like the U.S. Army Center of Military History and Oxford Reference, is considerably more tangled. On August 8th, 2 days after Hiroshima, 1 day before Nagasaki, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and launched a massive invasion of Japanese-occupied Manchuria. For Japan's military leadership, this wasn't a minor development.
Japan's government had been quietly hoping the still neutral Soviet Union might help broker a negotiated peace with the Allies, softening the terms of an eventual surrender. That hope collapsed within hours of the invasion. The one door Japan's leadership thought might still be open had just been slammed shut by the same power they'd been counting on. Inside Japan's Supreme War Council, this triggered an open and bitter split. Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo, along with other civilian leaders, pushed hard for immediate surrender. A faction of military hardliners, led by War Minister Korechika Anami, argued for fighting on, betting on a brutal, costly defense of the home islands might still force better terms from the Allies, even at that late stage. The disagreement nearly turned violent. On August 14, 1945, a group of army officers attempted a coup, storming the Imperial Palace grounds in an effort to seize and destroy the recording of Emperor Hirohito's surrender announcement before it could be broadcast. The coup collapsed within hours, its leaders either arrested or dead by their own hand. On August 15, 1945, Hirohito's recorded voice was broadcast to the Japanese public for the first time in the nation's history, announcing surrender. Historians still debate, and likely always will, which factor tipped the balance: the bombs, the Soviet invasion, or the combined shock of arriving within 72 hours of each other. What's clear from the documented record is that this wasn't a single decisive blow. It was a collapse under pressure from multiple directions at once, argued over by men who were themselves nearly out of time.
Part 8. Legacy. Ashes, cranes, and a debate that never settles. Hiroshima and Nagasaki did not stay ruins. Today, both are modern cities of well over 1 million people combined, rebuilt, industrious, and largely unrecognizable from the photographs taken in the weeks after the bombings. But the human cost didn't end when the fires went out. Among the survivors was a young girl named Sadako Sasaki, who was roughly a mile from the Hiroshima blast when it detonated. She lived through it with no visible injury. 10 years later, at age 12, she was diagnosed with leukemia, one of thousands of delayed casualties from radiation exposure that continued to surface for years after the war ended. During her hospitalization, she began folding paper cranes, inspired by a Japanese legend that folding 1,000 would grant the folder a wish. Her story, documented and preserved by the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum, became one of the most recognized human symbols of the bombing's long aftermath. To this day, visitors from around the world send paper cranes to Hiroshima in her memory. The debate over whether these bombings were a necessary end to a brutal, years-long war or an avoidable tragedy inflicted on civilian populations has never fully settled. Military historians, veterans' families, ethicists, and the American public have argued over it for 80 years, and archival research from institutions like the National World War II Museum and the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum continues to surface new detail that reshapes parts of the conversation. What isn't up for debate is this: real people with names, families, and futures lived through the single most destructive moment in the history of warfare. Sadako Sasaki, Tsutomu Yamaguchi, hundreds of thousands more who were never individually recorded at all. Their stories carry a weight that no textbook paragraph and no documentary can fully contain, only try to honor. Like and follow for more untold history.
This channel exists to dig past the headline version of these stories and into the documented human reality behind them. The men who argued over target lists, the ones who flew the missions, and the ones on the ground who lived through what came next. Drop a respect in the comments if you remember their sacrifice.